Ladies and gentlemen, we're back here again with Zanders, Inspirational Podcast, a ZIP. This is going to be, at first, we're actually do this as like a trial thing for our, we'll cut this music off because I know our guest loves it. But we're going to try this as like a early access. If you joined our Patreon, that we're really excited that's coming out. And so we figured we could just really load up on it and just be like, hey guys, here we are. And so I actually have a guest on that has declined interviews with several people about his newly found, I'm not going to say newly found passion, but newly found drive to be a comedian. I've got Gene Jackson here with me tonight. Gene Jackson, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well, man. I'm not gonna generally I'll say Jeremy whenever I was talking to Wicked in the past, and I'm pretty sure that Bob or Bill also goes by Bill. So I'm pretty sure he's a mark for himself and didn't change his name. So I'm not gonna call you by your last name, but I know it. That's how this stuff works around here. I'm inspirational, but I know you, so I demand inspiration out of this, Gene.
I got enough names going on without us throwing another one a fourth one in the mix. So
Yeah, I know. But I've got a business card that says otherwise. You always remember that, Mr. Jackson. We kind of, I mean, this was the Buck Jenkins and the Whitey Jenkins. A lot of this was kind of over the last year. It's kind of us as ex-professional wrestlers or whatever, kind of started pushing, hopefully to the point where you would start doing more shows and start traveling more with something that could be, actually honestly something good for your career.
yeah, let's talk. So let's talk about that. The comedy thing.
Mhm.
When I was a kid, most people loved baseball and basketball and football and whatever. Sports and cartoons and all this shit. And yeah, I was as a little kid, I like G.I. Joe and Transformers and all this crap. But I didn't like any sports. I played baseball. I liked playing football in the backyard. I didn't give a shit to watch it on TV. I didn't have a team.
No college
Um,
fan.
wasn't a college fan at all.
Yeah.
I would, from the time I was a little kid up until yesterday, I guess, I would pull for whoever everybody else. If I was hanging out with my Mississippi State friends, then I was for Ole Miss. If I was hanging around my Ole Miss friends, then I was for Mississippi State. If I was hanging
Yeah.
around with both, then I was for Alabama. When I
You're
got to
just
Alabama,
trolling.
I was for Mississippi. Whatever,
Yeah.
Tennessee.
Yeah.
I own a Tennessee hat just to anger people. When I lived in Mississippi, I wore an Alabama hat just to be an asshole, and then when I moved to Alabama, I bought a Tennessee hat.
You remember the first time you started trolling people? Because I mean, clearly it was just you being a troll before like being a troll was even a terminology. Do you remember like age?
When I was a kid, but it was I didn't consider it trolling. I didn't know what trolling was, but here's what it was, and then we'll circle back around to comedy again, and everything always ends up back on wrestling. But I love where I was going with that is I love professional wrestling and I love comedy.
Yeah.
Now, as far as me trolling people, when I was a kid, like when I would get off the school bus every day, there was people yelling out the windows at me. Because as I would sit at the back of the bus, and as I would come up the aisle, I would just shit talk everybody on the way up the aisle. And as I get off the bus, they're all yelling at me. And in my mind,
wasn't you getting bullied? It was you just
no. In my mind, it was just me being a heel. Like I got good heat coming off the bus today. But nobody took it personally. Like people didn't literally hate me. They're like, "That's just Gene. That's just it's how he is." Kind of like now, I mean, even now, I mean, I'm sure you've had to tell people before. That's just Gene. You don't mean it. He's not really a dick. So that's just kind of how that always was. So in my head, that's just me being a heel before I was ever in the wrestling business. It was just a personality quirk. I remember I've said this in a couple interviews, and I talked about this with poor Flynn Hendricks. I told him a lot of this was exclusives. I never really talked about it elsewhere, but I didn't know it was going to take 2 months for his podcast to come out. So this is probably going to beat him to the punch. Although his may come out before ours leaves Patreon. So
maybe we'll see.
But anyway, the very first stand-up comedy I ever remember watching, we had Cinemax when I was a kid, and Bill Cosby himself, that comedy special, him sitting in a chair telling jokes for an hour and 20 minutes, used to come on like every other day. And I watched it probably 100 times as a kid. I used to could quote that thing verbatim. And it fascinated me because I thought, man, this guy makes a good living just sitting up there telling stories. Being funny. But he mostly told stories. It wasn't like set up punch. It was just funny stories. I thought, boy, that's boy, that sure must be cool to do, you know. And I wasn't an athlete. Like I played little league baseball. So in my mind, I loved wrestling, but I thought I could never be a wrestler. I'm not athletic enough. But I might could be funny enough to be a comedian. So that just always kind of stuck in the back of my head, you know. Um, so I ended up getting into wrestling because I was living in Aberdeen, Mississippi. There's no big cities around where there was
Yeah.
a way in for comedy.
Yeah.
You know, I lived 3 hours away from Birmingham.
Hmm.
I didn't know anything about the comedy clubs then or anything. So I got into wrestling in 97, did that for a few years till I married my first wife who hated wrestling, who hated me going to wrestling, who thought every minute that wasn't spent at work, we should be up each other's ass. So it wasn't worth fighting with her. So I quit wrestling for several years. I replaced wrestling with writing for Jimmy Blaylock's website, Brian Trammell's website. That's how I know both those guys.
Yeah.
Eventually led to me doing podcasts, which leads us here. Um, but during that time, me and the ex-wife went to the Stardome in Birmingham because I also ended up in Alabama when I got married. And so we went to the Stardome in Birmingham, Alabama. We saw a comedian, and they talked about we have open mic night coming up on April or whatever. So we went back and went to the open mic night. And we got in the car and was driving home, and she was like, "Yeah, you should try that. Hell, you're funny. Didn't you always say you liked comedy?" And I was like, "Yeah." So I went up and did the open mic and kind of liked it. Started writing stuff. Did it off and on for a couple of years there. Then
Do you remember your first open mic? Do you remember anything about it?
the first one, not really.
Okay.
Um,
Have you, is that, so it was just so, were the crowd into it? Was there anything?
I mean, I got laughs. So the first open mic I ever did, because I didn't know. I mean,
Yeah.
until you get involved in it, you just think, oh, you just go up there and you're funny, you tell
Yeah.
jokes. Well, I mean, and I had three jokes that I could remember that I had heard in college. And so I told those three jokes, which is like, you know, a big no-no in comedy, like street jokes they
Street
call them, you know,
jokes. Yeah.
stuff that you didn't write.
Yeah.
So I told three of those, and then I had written, because at that time I had like a 40-minute drive to work every day, much like I do now, and I
Yeah.
used to listen to Sirius radio every day. So I listened to Howard Stern on the way to work, and then I would listen to, there was like 6 different comedy
Yeah.
channels.
Yep.
So I listened to them coming home. So I had wrote a little bit of material. So I did those jokes, did the material I wrote, and it all got pretty good laughs. And so I kind of improved upon that the second time I went up, which is actually somewhere on YouTube, I believe. I don't
We'll try to
put that
find it.
out. I
I'll
won't
get
put that
CC
out
on
there because I don't love it. I mean, I got
it. I'll
laughs,
have
but I mean,
CC find it.
wasn't
I
great.
got it.
But anyway, so and I met. I think the second time I went, or maybe the first time, I met Matt Mitchell, Casio Kid, who at the time was doing the Rick and Bubba show. He was an
Hmm.
intern for Rick and Bubba, was just starting out doing comedy, and he had went to school. He was out. I lived in um, Albertville, but I was working in Rainbow City, Gadsden,
Hmm.
and he actually had grown up and went to school with a couple of girls I worked with at Walgreens, and so we kind of got to know. Oh, you know her? Yeah, yeah. So kind of got to know each other there, and then that would come back into play down the road.
Hmm.
Um, but I kind of strayed away from it. You know, I would do it off and on. My work schedule really didn't jive too well with it,
Yeah.
working at Walgreens with a shitty schedule I had. And then when I got divorced from my ex-wife, my first big to her was to start back wrestling again. So I immediately jumped back into
Dropped
wrestling.
off of that. Yeah.
And so the comedy kind of went by the wayside. And so I would do it every now and again, off and on through the years. By the way, that was 2006 when I started
Yeah.
doing that. That kind of went away, but every now and again I'd go to an open mic or do something, but I really didn't do it hardly at all until 2000, gosh, I don't remember what year it was, 15,
Yeah.
14, 15. Matt Mitchell, Casio Kid, did a show at the Ritz Theater in Alabama City here in Gadsden, and he knew at that point I was living down here, and he hit me up and asked me, did I want to host it? And I was like, yeah, of course. Hell, I hadn't done at that point. I hadn't done stand up like 6 years. Like I had
Yeah.
nothing. He's like, hey man, have you got about 10 minutes? I'm like, hell yeah, man, I got 10
I
minutes.
got this.
So I'm like, oh shit. So usually, so like another little thing about comedy is like, you go to open mics and try new stuff. That's
Yeah.
where you try all the new stuff. But
Mhm.
anytime you get a booked gig like that, you use all your tried and true
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, everything I did that night was all new. I did like 2 jokes from like I had done on open mics, but most of them were pretty dated, so I had to drop most of them. But that went pretty well. I opened for him. He was the headliner. Corey Ryan Forrester was another opening act who's a pretty big deal now. He's touring all over the country, part of that Well Read comedy tour. So that kind of got me back into it for a little bit, but not really anything. It's hard to get into. It's so much like wrestling.
Mhm.
It's a lot of driving for little to no money to
Mhm.
get your foot in the door, to start to get a reputation, to get better bookings. And the way my work schedule was at the time, it just wasn't conducive to doing that. So again, I would just do it sporadically here and there. And then where Whitey Jenkins ties into all this. So doing commentary for Kevin Brannon's IWA Deep South slash $10 wrestling slash LXW, whatever he fucking called it that month. I was doing, it's kind of where my two worlds collide for the first time. I'm doing commentary on a wrestling show, but it's
Not
a
what it
really
was.
bad wrestling
Yeah.
show, worse than the one we did for our recent
Mhm.
Patreon
Yep. Oh, it's
commentary
yeah,
bit
yeah.
or
It's
watch
rough.
along.
It's
Uh,
bad, bad. It's a parody. I mean, it is what it is.
yeah.
It's a parody of what people consider what wrestling is.
So
So
it
you got to
was it was
go.
me. It was me and a guy who was formerly a traveling national stand-up comedian, Tim Statham, who had retired from comedy and was back working in Birmingham, but he would do shows sporadically at Stardome. Kevin saw him there, looked him up on Facebook, and hired him to be a commentator. And then, or he already had me. So me and Tim sat around before the show and talked. And he had kind of watched wrestling off and on in the 80s, Dusty Rhodes era and all that. So we had a great time doing it. And after the show, Tim's like, man, you ought to do stand up comedy. I'm like, I used to. And he's like, oh shit, why don't you do it anymore? I was like, because I do this dumb shit more than I do anything else. He's like, well, you should come open for me sometime. And I was like, okay, well, so that kind of put comedy back in my head, but
Mhm.
nothing really happened. But the reason I mentioned that is because our good friend Jeremy Flint also worked for Kevin Brannon. And he would wrestle as Jeremy sometimes. Then he came up with this character.
Another character,
Um,
very controversial.
no,
Very
we're not getting to that.
controversial.
We're not to that
Okay.
one yet. First, he had a character called Kyle Bakula. I can't remember what the nickname
Okay.
was. But anyway, Kyle Bakula was a backyard wrestler. And it may have just been the gimmick backyard superstar Kyle Bakula or whatever. But anyway, he's a backyard wrestler. He wrestles in Zubaz and a homemade belt like he'd made out of like plywood and a piece of something. Um, and he came out to Real American.
Naturally,
and,
of
and
course.
so me and Flint hit it off because he's a funny guy. He's real
Yeah.
creative. He loves doing characters and stuff like that, which is something I'd never really done.
Mhm.
And he created this character. So me and you do this. We do this in our group chat a lot of times. If we did a quarter of the harebrained shit that we'll post in the group chat, hey, we should do this, it'd be funny, and sometimes we do it. Sometimes it's just making the day go by. So we kind of had one of those group chat situations going on, and Kevin had come up with this idea for this soft core cup thing that he was going to do, and so he had more harebrained ideas than anybody. Like every day, he had some wild idea, and it was going to be the next biggest thing in the world. So me and Flint would feed that. He'd be like, "Oh man, we're gonna do the softcore cup, man. It's gonna be great. It's gonna be the opposite of hardcore." So we were taking like old ECW names, like, "Oh, you could be, Bobby Dreamer," and instead of a kendo stick, they're using whatever. So Flint threw out. He goes, "Oh, I could be Rape Face Ronnie Jenkins," and Kevin honed in on that.
It was, yeah.
Yeah, man, you got to be Rape Face Ronnie Jenkins, man. That'll be awesome. So Flint was like, "Well, it's a name,
It's a
I can do
name.
that." Well, as they're pitching out all the, he could be this, he could be that, um, the first thing Flint attributes to this guy is coincidentally Ronnie Jenkins talks just like Kevin Brandon, but Kevin doesn't pick up on that apparently. And so Kevin's like, "Yeah, he could be he's Rape Face Ronnie Jenkins, and he's like a pedophile, like he likes like young girls." And so Flint thinks, "Okay, well that would be funny. I'm doing a character that you don't even realize is a parody
Your
of
voice.
you,
Your
your
voice.
voice. So yeah, fuck it. We'll make it we'll make him a pedophile because we're making fun of you." And so they come up with this character, and he wears Daisy Dukes. He's got a blonde wig and all this. And so, and this story is all over the place, but hopefully you can kind of follow it enough to make some sense of it. So one of the first things we do to set up for his big wrestling debut coming up at the Softcore Cup, which was going to happen at the actual Carnage Cup. So you got all these people that converge to see death matches. And in the midst of it, we throw in this softcore shit.
Yeah.
But before we get there, Kevin arranges to do a interview at TJ Burke's house. This would be the first time I had met TJ in passing, but this is the first time I really remember meeting him and registering who he is and everything.
Yeah.
So we go to this house in Birmingham. And so Kevin's got this wild idea. He's like, "All right, so so he gets Bryant Woods, who was a deathmatch wrestler, who had this girlfriend who she was like 23, but she looked like she was like 17.
Yeah.
Kevin had somehow taken notice of. So he pays Bryant to bring his girlfriend, and he pays Flint to come be Ronnie Jenkins, and he pays me to come do an interview. So what he sets it up to look like is like a Dateline. Who's the guy? The Catch a Predator guy.
Yeah.
Chris Matthews.
Chris Hansen.
Hansen, yeah. So I was gonna be like a Chris Hansen type. Still Gene Jackson, but for whatever reason now I'm busting fucking pedophiles.
Yeah.
So they shoot footage of him going and picking this chick up and driving up to the house. He's in his damn Daisy Dukes. And so they film them in bed together. Just hokey shit. Nothing.
Yeah. The edge and Lita thing, all that stuff.
Yeah. But anyway, all this builds towards me interviewing
allegations,
Ronnie Jenkins, and these accusations. And so Kevin had written out ahead of time a chat between him and a couple of different young girls.
Convincing.
But so he's like, "All right, so we're going to sit down and do this." So TJ, this first time either one of us has really been around him. So TJ's like, "So where's the script?" And Flint's like, "We don't have a script." And he's like, "Y'all got to have a script. You can't just riff." I was like, "The fuck we can't." And he's like, "Y'all can't." Like, he's wanting this to go for like 40 minutes. And I was like, "You don't know,
we got it."
He's like, "Kevin, you got to have them a script." So this pisses me and Flint off to no end. I originally was not a fan of TJ after this initial meeting. I've come to like him later.
Yeah.
But so me and Flint we walked outside and we're like, "Well, fuck this motherfucker. We'll show him, But we had this stupid chat that he'd written, and it was really
bad.
Anyway,
bad.
It was bad.
Yeah.
But we made it work. And so me and Flint, I think I still have the DVD around here somewhere. You need to see it sometime.
I'd love.
Me and Flint have both said at different times that it's probably the most embarrassing thing we've ever done, yet somehow we're both most proud of it because of the fact that, he didn't think we could do it. and we pulled it off, and it was funny.
That would be something that you would have to pay and then come into like a private seating of where we took your phone and you would not. I've heard stories. I've got to sit down and we'll have Flint on here. Hopefully one day, probably not.
We
To
may find a way to sneak that on the Patreon at some point too.
Oh, do you? But here's the problem: is I don't want people being able to record that and it being just broadcasted amongst the universe.
Maybe just clips. Anyway,
yeah, I was about to say. Yeah.
Anyway, not to get too bogged down in that section of the story. So anyway, Ronnie Jenkins makes his debut at the Softcore Cup, and we do an angle, and he becomes the Softcore champ. No, I think Lane actually won the Softcore. Anyway, that's neither here nor there.
And I mean, that match was like, for wrestling fans who are listening to that, if you haven't seen that match, it was legitimately to the terms of softcore. Like, it's where
they were hitting each other with weapons wrapped in bubble wrap and toilet paper.
It was a parody of a parody, and so that's where Gene got to dumpster fire that.
Kevin loved it. Kevin loved this Ronnie Jenkins character. Literally loved the Ronnie Jenkins character. He booked a whole a softcore cup tournament up in somewhere in Tennessee. I don't remember the name of the town. But he brought in back before he got canceled, obviously, Joey Ryan and Cliff Compton and all these Chikara guys and everything. And the whole thing was built around Ronnie Jenkins winning the tournament. He wins the Softcore Cup. They shot a thing in a van with that same girl that was questionable. But it started kind of blowing up online, and people who didn't like Jeremy, people who didn't like Kevin, people who didn't like I2B Deep South.
People don't like that kind of humor.
We're pushing that, they got this pedophile character, which if you watched any of it, it was also tongue-in-cheek. You couldn't really take it serious. But without context, Jeremy Flint plays a pedophile, and he's got these videos with a young girl. Well, that doesn't play well.
No.
So that got back to his ex-wife, who was threatening to not let him see his daughter. Like, some real, very real shit came out of that.
Yep.
To where finally Flint was like, I'm not doing that character anymore. And Charles, I swear to God, you would think literally a member of Kevin Brandon's family had died. He was so upset. And he kept trying to find ways to bring him back, to the point that I go online and put a story about how Ronnie Jenkins was killed in a car wreck, in a van crash. He flipped his rape van or whatever.
By the way, what year is this? So we just have a good timeline context to that.
16, 17.
So not even that far long ago, like less than a decade ago.
Yeah.
Probably
15, 16, 17, somewhere in there. Because it was before Joey Ryan really blew up all the way, because I just remember him being at All In, which was 2018. This would have been about 2 to 3 years before that.
Yeah.
So he won't do the character anymore, and Kevin's just beside himself. Well, fast forward a couple of years, and eventually I kept saying, because I was always dumbfounded that Kevin never really picked up on the fact that Ronnie Jenkins was a parody of him.
Yeah.
So there's certain things that people tend to know about Kevin Brandon, and one of them is that he's allegedly a racist. He says that's not true. Or he would have never had a Mexican win the Carnage Cup. That's a quote. And he booked black guys, so clearly he was not racist.
Yeah, he's good.
So as a joke, I had said, well, hell, if we can't get Jeremy to do it, we'll just have Ronnie's cousin Whitey Jenkins show up. And he jumps on that.
Oh, yeah.
Hell yeah, man, Whitey Jenkins, that'd be great. That'd be hilarious, blah, blah, blah. So pandemic comes around, and I'm sitting at home. I worked from home at the time, as you well know.
Yep.
And because me and you were friends at this point and talked on a regular basis. And this kind of snuck up on you as well. You were like, "What?"
Yeah, I got to see this unfold because because us working together, I got to hear nothing but like Kevin Brandon, like, "Oh my God, this dude is a walking dumpster fire, horrible person. Probably needs to be taken behind the barn, Old Yeller style." And like then I started hearing about this and like, okay, I'm following, but Gene, but you're gonna have to get me a little deeper, please.
So I'm working from home. So I'm not ever leaving the house. Rosie's working down in Gadsden, staying at her dad's during the week. No marital issues. We were preparing to move down here, and she got a job before
that was the toughest. That was probably the toughest part of y'all's marriage, to be honest, is being away that long.
We were under a lease, and I was under a contract with my job, and so we had to stay there until both of those ran out. So anyway, I had all this downtime. I worked from 6:30 in the morning till 3:30 in the afternoon. And after that, it was just me and the cats. So I ended up getting a bandana with a wig made into it, and I sat down one day and recorded a YouTube video for Whitey Jenkins wrestling school.
It was a long video too, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, it was your biggest criticism. It's too long. It's too long.
Well, how long was it, like 40 minutes ish?
No, it was like 8 minutes. You said it needed to be 90 seconds or some shit. It was like 8 or 9. It was like 8 or 9 minutes.
Yeah, it was funny.
And so I did that one, and then I think I did the first one. I think it was Meet Whitey Jenkins, and it was just that. And then I did one for his wrestling school.
Yeah.
And so people started seeing it and messaged me about it, and and so then Kevin's like, "Man, we got to use Whitey Jenkins." So I did a couple of shows for him before me and him had a falling out, to say the least.
Thank God.
But people liked it. The P3 guys wanted me on their show, and I did an interview with them that went really well, and people were shocked. Like Brian Trammell, who knows those guys better than he knows me, and he's like, "That had to be like y'all had that scripted, like that was all worked out." I was like, "No, none of that was. That was all off the cuff." And he's like, "Holy shit!" So I started trying to figure out ways to use Whitey Jenkins, but I'm like, well, okay, Whitey Jenkins. Now that I'm not, because the whole character just created for me to do Kevin's show and make fun of him. So Whitey Jenkins was a parody of Kevin Brannon, the IWA Deep South promoter, Mickey Henry, the Boaz promoter, and a little bit of Dump Zanders thrown in because he wore that gray vest. And he didn't pay people.
And he did pay people.
Allegedly.
Well,
but
Buck pays people, but it's normally in opioids. So,
so I got the itch to start doing stand up again because I was watching a lot of stand up comedy during all this downtime where I was hanging around the house. Mm-hmm. Well, I reached out to this club. There was a comedy club down in Anniston, and so I had reached out to them, and they was like, "Yeah, come on down." Well, I'm all the way in Coleman, so I never did go down there. And by the time we moved to Gadsden, I don't even remember who suggested it, but somebody at some point, I said, "Yeah, I'm trying to work on. I'm doing this Whitey Jenkins shit, but I'm also trying to write some stand up material." And they said, "Oh, why don't you do Whitey Jenkins on stage?" And it had never occurred to me, and I was like, "Well, no, you could." Well, I don't know. So I was having trouble writing material because, like I say, I've read, I don't know how many books on comedy, a dozen or more books on stand-up comedy, watched all kinds of, stuff about it.
No, you've done your homework. You've definitely done
the psychology behind it.
Even newer stuff. That's kind of,
So, if you analyze it deeply, there's all this, you have to have a comic voice and a persona and your motivation for things, and your jokes are based on, who people perceive you to be and all this. And so my material would kind of be all over the place because, I'd write this joke and then this joke. I'm like, well, this joke don't necessarily complement this joke because they don't exactly match up. And that probably doesn't make any fucking sense. But my point is, like, okay, if I get up here and I tell these two jokes and somebody's sitting in the crowd and they're like, okay, we've never seen this guy before. We don't know this guy. But if we're trying to figure him out based on his jokes, these two jokes are kind of contradictory. So we don't really know. Yeah. We don't know what this guy's about. you know. So I started trying to write jokes that I would think Whitey Jenkins would tell if he was on stage. And while I didn't know who Gene Jackson was as a comedian, I knew exactly who Whitey Jenkins is. And
Yeah.
everybody in the crowd, wherever you go, the minute they see Whitey Jenkins and they hear that voice, they know that guy. If
Yeah.
they don't know that guy, they know a guy just like him.
Yep.
They know what his thoughts are. They know what his motivations are.
They know his
So
outfit. They know
they
everything
know,
about
yeah. So they
it.
know, like, okay. As soon as you walk out, like, hey man, you know, like,
Yeah.
okay, we
Yep.
know what this is going to be,
Yeah.
for better or worse.
Yeah.
So it made it easier to write for because I know, okay, pick a topic. I know what Whitey's take on this is, you know. So I start writing stuff, and I called the guy, or I emailed the guy from Anniston, the Happy Hour Comedy Club. And I'm like, hey, I got this character that I've been doing online. And I sent him a video, a trimmed down video of one of the YouTube things. There had several by then. And I said, I want to try this on stage. And he's like, yeah, come on down. So I did, and he loved it. And he's like, anytime you want to come, you know, come. I'm getting emails from him every week. Hey, you coming this weekend? Can you come next weekend? Could you come Friday and Saturday? So I started going down there and doing that regularly, at least a couple of times a month, for starting in December of 21.
Yeah.
Was the first time I went down there. And so I would do, sometimes as Whitey Jenkins, sometimes as Gene, back and forth, back and forth. And it kind of got to where I really liked being Whitey Jenkins better because, again, I know who that guy is. I know how to write for him. And you feel kind of removed from it. Like, it doesn't matter what I say because nobody thinks I really think or feel this, because clearly this is a fucking character. Clearly this guy's a dumbass.
Yeah. No one would
So
ever,
he can say anything.
Yeah.
Nobody's judging me because it's not me.
It's
this guy.
It's not you. Yeah.
So
At
I thought,
any
you know
point-
what? We're going to squeeze Gene out of this and become Whitey. Okay. And that's where it started to become a problem, because people hear the name Whitey Jenkins. More importantly, though, people read the name Whitey Jenkins. And while they can see the character, hear the character, and make assumptions about him, if you read that name, you're going to make some assumptions.
Well,
and like
most
I
people
said,
read it before they even see the
yeah,
picture.
if you get booked on something, they're going to see your name on a flyer.
Yep.
And then if they see a picture of that guy and that name on a flyer, I don't know if we want to go to that.
Exactly.
And I can't say that I don't understand the connotation, because, again, I picked the name to mock a guy who's allegedly a racist. So I get how you make that assumption, because I did it that way intentionally. But by the time that the first time I ever heard somebody say, yeah, I don't know about putting that name on a flyer, I already had a podcast going. I already had all these graphics I had made. I already had T-shirts made, and you know, people. I had a kind of quite a few people.
I remember when this
established.
happened. Well, I remember this happened, and you were it was like whenever you've decided to switch from Gene full time to go start doing Whitey, it was like the wheels really got into motion, and you could see like, oh, here I go, here I go, here I go. And it was good, you know, full steam ahead for a little while. And I remember the Buck thing also, because.
And I kind of already had one foot out of wrestling at that point, and really wanted to lean into comedy. But and I asked a few friends, you being one of them, like, you know, should I change, you know, the name? And most folks, first person I asked was the owner of the comedy club in Anniston. He's like, hell no, that name's great, it's perfect. And mixed reaction from I think you were one that said, yeah, I could see why.
I mean, why not? It's like saying the F word. You don't have to say it. Why say it? Why paint yourself into that corner? Like, they can make that assumption. That's implied humor. But I
thought, well, I've already got so much of the shit out here with his name. I really didn't want to do it just because I didn't want to have to explain why I was doing it for the biggest part. And to make it seem like there was anything wrong about it to begin with. So I continued on. And some people had like adamant, like hell no response
Yeah.
to it.
Yeah. Double down
So
on it. That was their hill to
yeah,
die on. Yeah, for some reason.
yeah, and so kind of forged ahead. And then I even had the idea, and I know I talked to you about this because we almost did a podcast about it. And now I'm kind of glad we didn't. But I had come up with the plan of, all right, I'm going to take aspects of Whitey Jenkins and mix them with Gene Jackson and call myself Gene Jackson, but essentially
Yeah.
Gene Jackson as he exists today will cease to
Was
exist,
going
and
to
he will become
be.
this weird hybrid of Gene
Yeah.
and Whitey. He'll dress like Whitey, but he won't have the voice, but he'll have the Gene Jackson name.
Yeah.
And
Well,
the
because
more,
it was because it was getting stressful to the point where like your voice is it's tough to do. I mean, like it's a voice. I mean, I know it's not a hard voice, but it is a voice. Like you are changing stuff about your voice.
yeah, and here's another, and where I learned that was a problem was going and doing like a full night's commentary as
Mm-hmm.
Whitey Jenkins at EPW. But where that also was a thing too is like in wrestling. So me and you especially had a lot of fun with forging Whitey Jenkins his name as his own, as a distinctly different character. I had
Yeah.
this Andy Kaufman
Yeah.
idea of, okay, deep down, most folks are going to know that Gene Jackson is Whitey Jenkins, but and I've said this to you and many other people, like, but I'm never ever going to own that publicly. I will never publicly say
Mm-hmm.
that I'm Whitey Jenkins. We're going to just,
I
deny,
mean,
deny, deny,
we had
deny.
ideas of you like bumping your head and realizing it like 6 years down the road and all this other shit. We had all kinds
Yeah,
of
we had a lot of
ideas
crazy ideas about it,
that we will never ever do.
but um, you know, we did a lot of like. I mean, I had a thing come up in my fucking memories today on Facebook where Gene argued with Whitey on a Facebook post.
Yeah, yeah, it's just one
Whitey
of those real embarrassing times.
made a veiled reference to Gene, who then argued with him in the comments back and forth.
Yeah, no,
Uh,
you and Waddy had quite a few disputes on
oh,
the
I'd always talk
podcast.
shit about him. Like, yeah,
Yeah,
like so they had me on P3 Radio was both. And I would talk about what a piece of shit Whitey Jenkins was, and Whitey would always say what an asshole Gene Jackson
yeah,
was, and then you and Whitey were always in
yeah.
dispute, and
It's always fun
Whitey
times.
didn't get along with Smokey and all this dumb shit.
Yeah.
But anyway, in wrestling, people can comprehend kayfabe
Mm-hmm.
and keeping two separate characters and all that. Comedy, like people have no concept of that.
Well,
So like
they're
I
here for
started
30
coming.
minutes and they're out. Like they do 30
Well,
like even like an hour-long special, like you kind of get out of that. Like you can still be your character out in the parking lot, but you don't have to. You can still walk up and shake your hand.
but even character comedians who are full blown characters, they still don't like try to maintain in front of the fans that they're a different
They're
person.
appreciative. They're appreciative.
Like I come out and go, hey, what'd you think of that show tonight? Where
Yeah.
I'm like, but so like once I started going to the comedy club, the owner would always introduce me as Whitey, no matter what, even if I wasn't in the gimmick. He'd like, hey, it's Whitey, and I would get so fucking mad. I'm like, hey, god damn it. So then that would make things confusing too. Like when I started trying to pick up bookings, like, yeah, there's two different Facebooks, but it's both me. I prefer you message this one. And I would have people messaging the Whitey Facebook, which I didn't ever get in that messenger. It was a pain in the ass to access it and all this. Beanie, shut up.
You're good. You can't hear him safely.
Okay, I can. It's blindingly annoying.
Yeah, Stacey's done flips a couple of times. Go ahead.
So in the back of my head, I'm thinking, I don't know. This may be an issue. So back to Cassio Kid that I mentioned earlier. So since those days, Cassio has now moved to Huntsville. He's co-host of the #1 morning radio show in the Huntsville market. He's a big part of Conrad Thompson's ad-free shows empire over there. He co-hosts a podcast with Road Dogg, and he stands in doing podcasts with Flair and Bischoff, Jim Ross, Tony Schiavone, all these different people. So I had heard from him, and he had expressed some interest in coming down to Anniston and maybe doing a show down there. And he said, "I see you're doing a lot of comedy lately. a lot more in the recent months. And I said, yeah. And he said, well, you should come open for me sometime. And he was going to have me open for him in Chattanooga, but Chattanooga threw him a curveball. And for those 2 shows, they had booked his openers. Usually they let him bring his own openers, but they, like a few days before, like, hey, we got your openers for next week. He's like, I've already got somebody. And they're like, yeah,
Yeah,
what people
you have
got.
2 of them.
So he hit me up and he's like, hey, man, bad news. Chattanooga's messed up. He said, but how about you just come do, this was on a Thursday before New Year's Day.
Yeah.
He messaged me on Thursday. He's like, hey, won't you come do Huntsville with me the next 2 nights? We're going to be at Stand Up Live. And I was like, I can do Saturday, but I'm booked in Anniston on Sunday, and I can't blow it off. Like, I've got to be there. And he's like, all right, well, come do Friday. I was like, cool. And so I say, do you want Gene or Whitey? Now, these messages between us had started around noon, and they went back and forth throughout the afternoon. So he would message, and I would finally see it, and I would message, and then an hour would pass, and so these all transpired over like a 4-hour period. I sent him a message and I said, Gene or Whitey at 3:02, at 3:04, Gene, in all caps.
Was that disheartening? Was that like more of like a shock? Like, okay, maybe if I want to do, because I also wanted to ask, is like character writing easier than writing for your perspective? Because Gene Jackson's from your perspective of the world, to where Buck Jenkins is, you get to take a step back into the audience and be like, okay, this is what I would see if I saw a dude in the Buck Jenkins attire.
Yes, this is what that guy would think. It makes the writing a lot easier because this is what that guy would think. And the next thing you always have to think is, even though, okay, yeah, Gene Jackson's not my real last name, but like I said, it's me. Everybody knows me. There's more people who know me as Gene Jackson than knows me as Gene Shilan. So, you have to take a moment and go, okay, if I go up and tell this on stage, if I put this out into the world, people are always subject now to have a cell phone, to have something out there to record you or quote you. Is this something I want to own? Because yes, it's a joke. Yes, it's all bullshit.
Yeah.
But there's people that take shit literally. There's comedians who end up in a lot of trouble because of something they said on stage and somebody recorded or quoted them in an article or whatever. So, it's hard to get somebody to understand. If I was to say something controversial and it got back to my bosses at work, and they pulled me into, and this is all hypothetical, probably would never happen.
Never.
But if they pulled me into an office and said, hey, we heard you said this doesn't reflect the values of our company, but you represent our company because you're up on stage, it's a lot easier to be like, no, this is a guy named Jenkins with sunglasses and a bandana and a fucking, that. This don't even resemble the guy that works for you. He don't even talk like the guy that works for you.
Yeah, listen to him. He doesn't even halfway.
There's really no connection between the two. So that makes it easier too, because it really opens up. There's a lot of things that I've said on stage as Buck Jenkins that I probably wouldn't have said as Gene.
And I've heard your material, and none of it's kind of even close to being controversial, but it does allow you to kind of open that up because you're not afraid of hurting what name.
Yeah, I mean, you've heard 10 minutes of it. There's another hour out there that's beyond that, but still, again, it gives me. I don't think I have to defend any of it because, okay, it's a character. It's this, But anyway, the short answer is yes, it does make it easier.
Yeah.
So anyway, I ended up talking to Cassio at that show, and I was like, "Boy, you sure was quick to say Gene." He's like, I just didn't know. We were going to have to share it on the, the Facebook of Stand Up Live and all. I just know how they'd feel about Whitey, And I was like, yeah, I got you. So the following weekend, we did a show in Anniston. So that Friday night, there's a guy named Robert Weems who travels around all over the country doing stand-up. He's based out of Atlanta, but he used to live in L.A. He's done some TV and different things. And he saw me. He's seen me a couple of times. He's seen me as Gene. He's seen me as Whitey. So he was sitting back there with me, and he's like, I liked your stuff as Gene. He's like, but man, he said that Whitey character. He's like, the character. He's like, I really like that. He's like, I'm gonna give you the name of a couple of bookers that I think would probably want to use you. He goes, but make sure when you reach out to them, explain to them what the character is. He said, because that name's going to scare them. They're going to
Yeah.
think it's something racial, you know. And I was like, okay. And so I was driving home that night, and I was like, that's 3 potential opportunities. Like, if I didn't have material as Gene, if I didn't have anything to fall back on, then I just wouldn't have got the Huntsville gig. He'd
Yeah.
have been like, no, we can't do Whitey.
Yeah.
And, you know, this other guy felt it necessary to preface, you know, hey, make sure. So I decided right then and there, I'm like, okay, before I get any more invested in Whitey
Yeah.
Jenkins, this name needs to change.
Because you're still like, especially as Buck Jenkins, he's still really young on the scene enough to where like if anything catches fire, like you've got a little bit of stuff out there, but not a lot of stuff. And
No,
especially now that it could be Buck, then it's going to be really difficult.
there's actually collectively, I think there were 3 or 4 TikTok videos that add up to be about 4 minutes worth of material
Yeah.
of like early. I mean, it was from December. I started going to happy hour in early December, and I recorded that on New Year's Eve. So I had only been going for a month. So that was very, very early Whitey material. And it was stuff that I had specifically just written that was like related to the holiday that I knew once Christmas and New Year's was passed, you couldn't do it anymore. So that's why I put it out there anyway.
Yeah.
So there was no Whitey Jenkins material other than the podcasts and the wrestling related shit. There was no Whitey Jenkins comedy stuff out there.
Yeah.
To relate to that name. So now, all the stand-up shit that's out there is all related to, you know, Buck Jenkins, which was done on purpose to, you know, establish that as the name and the brand and all that. Now, picking the name Buck, so I was like, all right, I'm going to change the name. And I had been kicking names around. I mean, you knew, I mean, it had been in my head for 6 months or a year to maybe change it, but I never really seriously thought about it. So I was like, well, I don't know. Like, well, let's just get some input. Well, that was a fucking mistake. I put a post on Facebook. Because number one, I wanted to go ahead and put it out there that I was changing it and why I was changing it.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Never asked the audience.
Yeah. I mean, you've seen some of the shit in the comments, but I mean, the worst stuff was in my inbox. No. And it wasn't, okay, Steve, you know, our buddy Delbert. Steve was mostly joking. Delbert was, most of his were jokes, I hope, anyway. But the other people were genuinely, they meant well. The most frequent one, be it in person, be it in the comments, be it in the inbox, everybody was pushing for Bubba Jenkins. And I can see that, but oh my God, that to me just felt too on the nose. Yeah. Like, that's just, of course, this guy's named Bubba. Why would his name be anything else but fucking Bubba? So
I heard Buck at the first time I heard it, and I was like, I like Buck. Buck suits better because I can see my granddad being named Buck, and like the same. I hunted with bucks. I know that.
that was the final. So I narrowed it down. It was Buck. There was 3 of them, and you know, honestly, I don't really remember what. I know Cash was one of them. I think based on like Johnny Cash. It's like Cash, Buck, and there was one other one. But Buck, the reason Buck finally won over in my mind was, like you said, deer. Like, I was like, okay, I can do like a logo with like antlers, and he can wear camo if he wants to, because we had already kicked around some ideas, and I'm going to say this out loud on video to hopefully make this fucking happen. So,
yes,
you know, we do the podcast, and so I had it in my head for a long time. So I started doing the Whitey Jenkins podcast. The very first incarnation of the Whitey Jenkins podcast that nobody remembers because there was only one episode. We called it the Mudcast because, you know, Whitey always talked about doing outlaw mud shows, like, you know, with Mud Show Mania.
Yeah.
And so Smooth Pleasing, we were going to do it kind of like the concept of Bruce Pritchard's podcast, where Conrad's asking Bruce about all these stories of wrestling. Well, it was going to be Smooth every week asking me, and I'm just, you know, we're making up shit each week. Yeah. And I don't know, we did one, and I didn't. It felt forced. I don't. Something about it just didn't feel right. Nothing on him. He
Yeah.
played his part fine. So then later I was like, all right, we'll have Buck interview or Whitey. That's the first time I've ever accidentally said Buck when I meant to say Whitey.
Good.
It's always the other way around. We'll have Whitey interviewing people, and those went okay, pretty good for the
Yeah.
most part. But I kept thinking in the back of my mind, like, Whitey needs a counterpart. Another, not exactly like him, but
Someone to
um,
like an antagonist almost. Like he needed an
almost.
antagonist.
We
Almost,
hadn't gotten there yet. I'm
but
working
like
on that. But
yeah,
I had an idea for a nephew that I wanted to bring to EPW, and the guy that I wanted to do it turned me down.
turn him down.
Fuck him.
Yeah, piece of
I'm
shit.
just kidding. He's doing great.
Congratulations on getting married or whatever.
Yeah, congratulations. He's doing wonderful.
That piece all right. Continue.
You don't want to waste your time using a gimmick name when you don't want Paul Levesque to not know your real name, because that's what they're going to book you as. Anyway, so we have Steve Pleasing on Cheap Heat TV Live one Sunday night. I knew of Steve. I can't say I knew him well. I'd met him a couple of times in
You
passing.
pissed him
Turned out
off.
the one time, turned out the one
off.
time I met him, he wanted to kill me, and I didn't know it.
Yeah.
But anyway, we did the podcast, and afterwards, I said something to you. I was like, "Boy, that could be Whitey's cousin as is. Like, we ain't got to gimmick him up.
Change his damn name."
And so you told him, and he's like, "Yeah." And so fast forward a little ways, and we end up in an EPW show, and we cycled through a couple. It was because if you watch those videos of me and him interviewing the Hot Shots and Diana Taylor, I think we were calling him. I forget what we were calling him in those. We weren't calling him Delbert initially. I mean, Delbert was like a side name, but that wasn't going to be the main name.
I don't remember either.
I think it was Steve or something, because we wanted Steve to be a running thread in his different names. But anyway, Delbert Jenkins was born, and he's Whitey's cousin. And I have wanted Delbert and Buck's dynamic to be more adversarial. That was my intention with it, but they always get along.
It's because Delbert, also Steve, is never going to not get along with somebody. He's going to make it awkward enough to it.
He's not an I say he's not an antagonistic guy. He can be, because when you lost your wallet, he was very antagonistic and ruined your night.
But he does it with a smile on his face, and he laughs. So it's harder to, and he knows what he's doing. He's an idiot genius. I mean, just to be honest. But no, he started doing that, and I remember you invited him to do comedy, and that he's a huge fan of it himself.
Yeah, so we talked about on the podcast that he had did stand up. They did these weird comedy shows at a wrestling show. They did a
wrestling comedy shows, and it was horrible. It was a terrible idea.
And so it didn't pan out. Yeah. He told at least one of his jokes on the show that got us kicked off.
Got us canceled. It got
canceled off
of a Twitch that I spent time on. I spent multiple hours on Twitch, and the first time he comes on, and that night, I think we had just started up. I was so excited about it. Oh yeah, and then he gets us canceled off of it, and you laugh, and then not only does he ruin all the work that I'd put into it, but then he got pulled into the gang as being now a comedian and a standing act on your show. So
I told him, I was like, come New Year's Eve. Because see, okay, there's a whole nother side story of I'm not going to even tell the story, but anyway, I got mad one night. I had a disagreement with another comedian and wasn't going to go back to the comedy club in Anniston. That was
a funny one. That's a whole other podcast, because I wanted to talk about that earlier, because I wanted to ask if you had ever did any heckling, but we'll do that another show.
Yeah,
we'll do another
we'll check in with, we may talk to Buck in character someday, but anyway, I wasn't really going to go back, but the club owner hit me up and was like, hey, could you come do New Year's Eve? And I said, yeah, if I can bring my cousin. And he said, yeah, I don't care. So I messaged Delbert and was like, hey, I got you booked for New Year's Eve. Get you some material together and don't do your F jokes.
That was a long
And
2 weeks. I can't remember how long of a. It felt like an eternity of just that, like. But that's a whole
but you
that's a whole
know,
other story how that played
but
out.
yeah, you know, I mean, I didn't know how that was going to play out. He was super paranoid, like
Mhm.
that night. And he was like, I'm just afraid I'm gonna go up there and suck. I'm like, I don't care, man. It's fine.
It's
Go up there
okay.
and
It's
suck. That's
Jackson.
gonna make me look
It's
better.
Aniston.
And he
Yeah.
went up there and he was funny. He got a lot of laughs. He's gone up a couple more times since then, and you know, he went with me to Amory. You know, so right the first show I did after changing the name to Buck, the following weekend, I went to Amory and did a comedy competition at a barbecue restaurant. Sounds more impressive if you leave that part off, but
Yeah, I was about to
you know.
say. No, it's a competition. Let's
But
just leave
anyway,
it
it's
at
a
that.
comedy competition, and Delbert went with me and
Yeah.
recorded it. That's why there's footage.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why it was why there wasn't footage of anything. I mean, it was usually just
Yeah.
me going. Who the fuck's gonna record it? A few times that Rosie went, she was usually too inebriated.
No.
It had been a recording of her shoes, and you'd
Yeah.
hear me in the
Yeah.
background.
Yeah.
Uh,
By the
just
way, you
kidding, not
won that
really.
competition. You won that competition
Yeah,
just to
so I
be.
won the competition. I won $100 cash, and because of winning it, now get to host the competition in March. And he was so pleased with how it turned out and how I did that I'm now not only hosting the competition, but I'm booking it. I've booked all the comedians that's going to be on it. I got Delbert on that one as well.
Delbert is
Um,
catching that one.
but you know, Delbert's all in, man. Like he's buying cameras and audio recording
Tripod,
equipment.
yeah, he's all over
He's
it.
got an iPad
He's in the
pod,
deep
and
end. He's in the deep end for
he's
sure.
looking at uh, a PA for us to run our own shows at some point. So
Heck yeah.
um,
Is that kind of
you know,
where you want to like? If I'm being honest, like the inspirational podcast here, we kind of talk about like not only just now, but like where you plan on being and where you'd like to see yourself. Would you like to get to where? Because I mean, Knowles did it also. Shane Knowles, friend of the podcast, did a stand up also. Would you like to get to where you have a group almost like you had with us and the gentleman and all that other stuff, to where you could start kind of sourcing yourselves out?
I would. You know, me and Steve talked about that quite a bit. You know, on that last trip we made, and it talked about it prior to that just on the phone. But
Yeah.
you know, and you know this, you know, you almost ran a wrestling show, and I unfortunately ran a handful of them.
Poorly apparently, but
If you want to run it, oh yeah, I was terrible.
poorly.
There was a single fuck said on my show. But there was a little asshole that was flipping people the
Flipping
bird.
people off, yeah, piece of shit.
Um,
Anyways.
but if you want to run a wrestling show, you got to have a ring. You got to have all this paraphernalia before you do anything,
Even
and you got to
step
book
into it.
wrestlers and
Yep.
all this different shit. So if you break down, if you book a comedy show at a bar
Yeah.
or your typical venue, you need a PA and you need some comedians, and that's about it.
That's about it.
You know, so there's not a lot of overhead in that. So that's what I had told Steve. I was like, you know, we got me and you, and I was like, if you know, if we can get Knowles on board, if he wants to do it, that'd be awesome. I like Knowles; he's a funny guy. And he, you know, you can talk.
He's
Me and him
clever.
can talk wrestling. He
Yeah,
knows
yeah.
old school wrestling.
He knows a lot about everything. He's a clever guy, and that's the
And
last
I was
thing
like, you know, if we get
positive.
a few of us together, I said, you know, we could go off and run our own comedy shows, and we make all the
You
money.
take the money. Yeah, you take the money and run off with it.
Because I mean, that's the deal. Like restaurants, bars, those types of places, they bring in the comedy just to get people in the door.
Yep.
Usually, they'll give the comedians the door because
Yeah.
they're making all their money off the food in the
Yep.
bar.
Yep.
So you can take you take all the door money. Well, normally you'd have to, if he was doing a wrestling show, you'd have to spend out all this money on a ring and all this
Insurance
other
and
insurance, all that shit.
liabilities and yeah. No,
And so, you know, Steve got to thinking about that coming back. He's like, damn, he called me a couple days later. He's like, man, I've been sitting here thinking about how much money we can make off of it. He's like, that's the way to go. And I was like, yeah.
see.
I was like, but here's the thing. we've got to keep going down to Anniston. We got to keep going
You
everywhere
got to
we can
get
go
good.
and get good. I
Yep.
said, and that's why I quietly spent a year.
Mm-hmm.
I said I didn't ask nobody to come see me down there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like I'd put it on Facebook because
Right.
I'm gonna be a dick if I didn't.
Yeah.
But I didn't ask any of my
No.
friends or family or anybody to come. I was like, I'm just gonna quietly go down here and do this until I feel like I've gotten pretty good. And then when I feel like I've got something to show people, then I'll try to do something with it. And so now, after doing it for a year, I'm not saying I've gotten great, but I think I've gotten
Well, you've
pretty
got
good.
some. You can hit like you got some home runner. Like you've got a home run hitter. Like if you had to go out there and give 10 minutes, even on like a television show, for God's sakes, you go out there and you could probably do 10 minutes to where you'd have one really hard hitter that would absolutely kill, and then you'd have something that you could hit a double or a single and kind of tune up the band. You know what I mean? Like I believe you have that.
I mean, I did in Huntsville. I mean,
Yeah.
I got a great response in Huntsville, and that was as Gene,
Yeah.
um, doing some of the same material you've heard, some
Yeah.
different. But that's what I told Steve is like just concentrate on going up and getting more
Being a
comfortable,
comedian. Being a comedian.
yeah, and then
Yeah.
we'll do the rest when it's time. And then same for Shane, but like
Yeah.
that's something I've always tried to do. Like if I have the opportunity to help somebody do something, if Steve wanted to do it and I have the opportunity to give Steve the opportunity, do it,
There
man.
you
Just
go.
like
Please.
Knowles,
Yep.
I reached out to him like, hey man, if you want to do this, I've got an in, do it. I was like that as best I could in wrestling. I'm going to do that as best I can in comedy as well. But
Yeah.
I think it still sounded weird to me for the first couple of weeks saying Buck Jenkins. It feels more comfortable now.
Yeah.
Um, everybody's taken to it pretty well. Nobody's been like, that's fucking stupid, So
Yeah.
I think it was a good choice. I think of the choices, I think it was probably the best choice. And I do think it was wise, moving away from Whitey for a
Yeah.
variety of reasons. So
And I know, and I'm hoping this is where you got some of your inspiration for Buck Jenkins also. Can we both agree that TK and Mike's Hunting Adventures was the greatest video series of all time? Just so we could put this out on podcast.
yes, and we were heading that direction, and I took a left turn
Yeah, you
somewhere.
did.
Uh, but yeah, that was one of the ideas. So we were kicking around ideas for just video content in general for the
Food. Yeah.
gentleman.
Yeah.
But also once Delbert became involved, we were talking about, man, we could do some hunting video because I think I said that first. I said, and that's what I had in mind,
Yeah.
but I didn't really think anybody besides maybe Delbert would have ever heard of that. It never crossed my mind that you would have
Yeah.
probably seen them because they were back in the VHS days. And
Yeah, they were old.
always assume you're 20 years younger than me.
Yeah.
You are 12
It's
or
some
15.
pretty close, yeah.
But I said something about hunting videos, and you were like, "Yeah, I like those TK and Mike videos." And I think I literally go, "Holy shit, you know what those
Yeah.
are?"
Yeah.
And you were
Got
like,
almost
"Yeah,
cracked.
man." And so we were driving down the road going to EPW or somewhere, and so you pulled them up on your phone to show them to Scott
Right, yeah,
and
just get
Delbert.
context of it, yeah.
And
It's one of
I
those.
think there's money there if
It's a
we could
beautiful
get
concept.
Buck and Delbert out doing hunting videos.
It's definitely
It'd be
something.
fun.
That's what the good thing is I'm kind of excited for y'all because I see a little bit. Hopefully, there's going to be a little bit more different content that's not wrestling because wrestling kind of pigeonholes you. There's not a lot of people who even like wrestling. Most people get turned off by the term wrestling. They don't want to listen to it. So I'm hoping.
And that's kind of why I'm weeding some of that out. Like we're getting ready to start doing some more podcasts. So the new podcast, we had to drop Whitey Jenkins show, and I told Delbert, like, well, I want to incorporate both of us in the new title. And so I said, well, what about this? I was like, I've been kicking this around. I named our New Year's Eve show this. I said, what if we call this the Drinking with the Jenkins podcast? And we're openly drinking as the show starts. I said, I'll be drinking Coke. I said, you'll probably be legit drinking.
Drunk. He'll be drunk. Not drinking.
I said, but I think the gimmick would be we start out very cordial, but we're drinking, and obviously throughout the podcast we get a little more adversarial, and they always end with us drunk, yelling, and pissed off, and it's like, this is it. We're never doing another damn show. And then next week it's like it never happened, and we progress through that each week. And he's like, yeah, I like that. I said, but you're
Sound
going to have
like
to
my
start being
dad.
meaner, to do that.
Yeah. He'll have to start imagining my face on your body. So,
But when I said that, he messaged me the other day and he's like, hey, I got this idea for this OWF show. I was like, I'm not saying we're going to do away with OWF forever.
but
I said, but right now, I said, while we got shows coming up that we're promoting, when we got this show coming up in Anniston, February the 18th, next weekend, we will be
quick
back
plug.
at Happy Hour Comedy Club with a comedy show and open mic, which people can go up and try this shit out, see if it's for
Give it a
them.
shot.
But I'll be there. Delbert will be there. Shane Knowles will be there, and our my buddy Wes Sears from here in Gadsden will be there. He's a really funny guy too. But anyway, I said I don't know if it's wise to be promoting these fake wrestling shows alongside promoting these real comedy shows, because then people are like, well, wait a minute,
What's real?
is the comedy show really happening?
Yeah.
So the comedy shows actually happen, but this wrestling thing is just completely made up. I think it'll confuse things. So I'm trying to figure out how to navigate that, because I don't want to completely do away with it. I put a lot of time and effort into
Well, and there's a lot of funny
up.
material. There's a lot of funny material in wrestling. If you can mock it, it's very funny.
So I think we're going to get Buck and Delbert established as a name and as a brand for that podcast, and then we'll figure out a way to bring the wrestling side back into it. But I think for now, I think it needs to kind of take a back seat until we.
Well, that's a ZIP exclusive that y'all are coming up with, Drinking with the Jenkins, coming out pretty soon. So everybody be looking for that. Hopefully, if by the time this has gotten off of our Patreon, this will be we'll have it announced on Cheap TV. But if not, get you some.
Yeah, hopefully there'll be one out there by then. I don't know how long we'll leave this on Patreon, but
we'll see.
We'll see.
Did you? I mean, like, I'm excited. I'm excited to see where y'all are going with this. It inspired me seeing how much effort and how excited y'all were going through all this, and like hearing there's some, clearly y'all have had a little bit of trials with some people acting like assholes and big leaguing you, but you've had a lot of triumphs. Like y'all proven that y'all have the chops for it, despite what dipshits say online.
Yeah, it's it originally came out of me doing comedy to start with. Originally came out of me having to have a creative outlet. If I can't work a wrestling show, if I can't perform doing that, then I got to do something to scratch that itch. So me and Steve, I keep alternating between calling him his real name and his gimmick name, Delbert, which we do in real life too, by the way. But me and Steve have talked frequently, both in travels and on the phone, about how nice it is to make these trips and not have to take bumps and not wake up the next day sore, not deal with all the dumb assery.
4 hours before the fucking show starts.
Yeah,
2 hours after.
Not have to deal with all the bullshit that wrestling involves, and actually, potentially make some money at it. I mean,
hell yeah.
Delbert's not at a point where he's really making money
yet,
young. But
he's really green. I mean, he's a couple of shows in green. You know what I mean?
I've made more money doing comedy in the last year and a half than I have probably ever in doing wrestling since 1997. And that's not to say it's a huge amount of money, but it's certainly more than
Hey, it's more
than not breaking even to go do shows, and that's usually the case.
Usually, almost every time.
Most people know that's a fact.
You
can act like it's not, but we know better.
We know better, and we're not going to get down that one because that's not.
No, that's yet another podcast.
This has been a very inspirational podcast. Okay, outside of shitting on Kevin Brandon, which is pretty inspirational. Don't be that guy. But hey, man, thank you. I guess this is where I'm going to do my outro real quick. Ladies and gentlemen, that was the ZIP podcast with me, Charles Zanders, as I hosted Gene Jackson coming on talking about Buck Jenkins. Go and check out everything on our YouTube at Cheap TV. If you can't find us there, then find us on Facebook. Well, you can find us, I promise that. Next time, we're going to find a guest that is just as interesting, maybe Delbert, maybe someone else, but we'll have one soon. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and y'all have a good night.